Getting on my nerves. There we go. There we go. Last week, we talked about the psychology of cult leader type personalities. Not necessarily cult leaders, but people who display similar traits. And specifically in the last video, we talked about the cult of Archewell, Meghan Markle and Prince Harry's organization. And as a content creator who receives an inordinate amount of hate and bullying and harassment from sycophantic fans, these followers who call themselves the Sussex Squad, Amber's Army, even off screen, I've had my fair share of being harassed and stalked by not only criminals, but their enablers, their flying monkeys, people who cover for them, excuse their actions, and even lie for them at court. Obviously, this isn't a new social media problem. Throughout human history, evil people have always existed, and so have their loyal followers. Followers who not only turn a blind eye and condone the evil of their leaders, but followers who are willing to perpetuate that evil and viciously attack anyone who dares criticize them. We all know about Hitler, of course. We know about the Charles Mansons and their cults. We know about the Epsteins, the Weinsteins, and now the P. Diddys. I mean, look at the sheer number of people who have, at best, turned a blind eye and pretended nothing was going on, but at worst, enabled them or covered for them or even participated in their debauchery. These weren't one-man shows. In P. Diddy's case, the indictment referred to his actions as part of a criminal enterprise. And have you heard of the allegations against the now deceased Mohammed Al-Fayed, the former owner of Harrods in London? Same deal. Apparently, if the allegations are true, the entirety of the Harrods team covered for him. They knew exactly what was going on because it was done blatantly, out in the open. Now, some of you might be thinking, all right, cool, but you're talking about Meghan Markle and her Sussex Squad on one end and then Hitler in the same sentence? Like most things, there is a spectrum of evil. On the one end, you have the most atrocious crimes against humanity, genocide, war crimes, murder. But then you also have the abusers, the liars, the frauds, the bullies, many of whom we've covered on this channel throughout the years, and they all have their followers too. So after not only observing this incredibly strange phenomena, but being on the receiving end of it for so long now, on the internet and off screen, I really wanted to get to the bottom of why. Why do evil people have loyal followers? I suppose a good starting point would be to define what is evil. And I wanted to go beyond the dictionary definition, hoping I would find some kind of really insightful, deep, psychological definition that we could run with. But it may surprise you to find out that for something so seemingly straightforward, defining evil can actually be quite complex. Especially when you consider that many people see it from a very subjective way. What is evil to someone may not be evil to someone else. Stock standard dictionary definitions include morally wrong or bad, harmful, detrimental, characterized or accompanied by misfortune or suffering, morally depraved, wicked, vicious, causing harm. You get the gist. And from a psychological perspective, one of the most straightforward answers I could find defined evil as a lack of empathy. Because when you lack empathy, you're selfish, and from selfishness stem all evil acts. So I came up with my own very straightforward definition: willfully causing harm to others. Now, just like in the law, self-defense and provocation are excluded or are defenses. But other than that, the act can be a one-off, repeated, as long as the elements of intention and harm to others are satisfied. So all these people I mentioned in the intro, from the Hitlers of the world to the Meghan Markles, based on what we've seen them do, I think we can all agree, unless you're one of their sycophantic fans or someone who's oblivious to what they've done, that they have each willfully caused harm to others in their own way, with this harm leading to some sort of negative or destructive result. And despite that, there are still hordes, legions of people from all over the world defending what they're doing, if not completely heralding them as a beacon of light, as an example for the rest of us to follow. I spent a lot of days trying to research this topic, trying to get to the bottom of why people follow evil people. And I always ended up reading literature that was about cults, which makes sense because when you think about it, a lot of this behavior, as I mentioned in the last video, the cult of Archewell, is actually cult-like. This overzealous and incredibly intense version of loyalty. So I will be borrowing a lot from cult literature, but that doesn't mean that I'm accusing everyone I'm talking about here of being part of a cult. All I'm saying is these groups, be it the Sussex Squad or even P. Diddy's enterprise, behave in a very cult-like manner. And if you're wondering what I mean by that, let's get some expert guidance on the matter. According to, Lalic pronunciation.
Dr. Yanya Lalich.
According to Dr. Lalich, who is a researcher and an expert in cults and extremist groups, some telltale signs, which are non-exhaustive, mind you, of a group or an organization acting a little too culty include the following. Having an excessively zealous and unquestioning level of commitment to their leaders. So basically, the leader's truth is the truth. Their leader's pain is their pain. It's like what we talked about last week with these Archewell employees of Meghan's coming out and saying, oh, if you come after our bosses, you come after us. Like it's some kind of a gang. I mean, they say we're not a criminal organization, but with that response, could you blame us for thinking it? The next one is really apropos. Questioning, doubt, and dissent are discouraged or even punished. I mean, isn't that literally the sole reason that these sycophantic fan groups exist? The group is elitist, claiming a special, exalted status for itself, its leaders, and its members. I mean, anyone who's tuned into the Meghan and Harry show on Netflix, which I had the immense misfortune of tuning into myself, would know that Meghan Markle has a messiah complex. The group has a polarized us versus them mentality, which may cause conflict with the wider society. Again, I point you to Exhibit A and literally anything else that the Sussex Squad or any of their ilk, they're not the only ones, but they're the ones that I have to deal with every day. Amber's Army as well, back in the Johnny Depp days. But that is their mentality to a T. The group teaches or implies that its supposedly exalted ends justify whatever means it deems necessary. So basically, it's very Machiavellian. The ends justify the means. This may result in members participating in behaviors or activities they would have considered reprehensible or unethical before joining the group. For example, lying to family or friends, collecting money for bogus charities. How about we throw in bullying, stalking, harassment, doxing? Am I missing anything? The leadership induces feelings of shame and or guilt in order to influence and control members. Often this is done through peer pressure and subtle forms of persuasion. This is the feeling that I got when I read that Us Weekly article from last week with Meghan rounding up all her employees, past and present, to sing her praises. And finally, subservience to the leader or group requires members to cut ties with family and friends and radically alter the personal goals and activities they had before joining the group. This one really only applies to Meghan Markle's husband, Harry, as far as I'm aware. And that's just a sample, really, because the list really could go on. I did say it's not exhaustive. But you see how you don't actually have to be a cult to have an organization that is pretty much a cult in all but name? MLMs are actually a really good example of this. In fact, there's an infamous and now incarcerated cult leader by the name of Keith Rainier, don't know if you've heard of him, who literally ran a self-help MLM that he called Nexium, which was actually a cult. He's now in prison, serving a 120-year sentence for crimes that include sex trafficking, forced labor, racketeering, fraud, amongst other things. All right, so we've covered the who and the what, but now for the why. Well, turns out there are a lot of whys. The most straightforward one that I think all of us can think of is money. And that falls under the umbrella of self-interest. According to Mark Wager, who is the chief leadership coach at the Australasian Leadership Institute, self-interest is the primary reason that makes people follow bad or evil leaders. Simply put, they do so because they personally benefit from their association with this so-called evil leader. Think P. Diddy's employees, or even Epstein and Weinstein. These people, these men in power, Mohammed Al-Fayed, with lots of money. Considering the scale of what these men did and for how long they not only did it but got away with it, there is no conceivable way, in my mind, that their staff, their bodyguards, their assistants had no idea that any of that was going on. In fact, I recently watched a BBC documentary about Mohammed Al-Fayed where his ex-bodyguards who worked for him in the 90s would talk about how they put two and two together, but it was just a joke and they never really did anything about it because that was the culture at Harrods, to laugh about it, to make light of it. Even over at Theranos, Elizabeth Holmes' now defunct company, all the employees knew, at least the ones in the lab, that she was committing fraud. The blood tests were not being tested on the Edison machine, and save for a couple of very brave whistleblowers, other people just went hush. So it's really beyond a hypothesis when we say that, in all likelihood, these people chose to deliberately turn a blind eye because the situation benefited them in some way. They probably got paid handsomely. They got to visit exotic places on private jets. Basically, life was better for them as long as they remained in the circle of this evil person. A side effect of self-interest is rationalization. So you start rationalizing the bad deeds of this evil leader. For instance, in Meghan Markle's case, we have heard that she screams and yells and reduces grown men to tears and she's psychotic and demonic. Then we see in the Us Weekly article, a current Archewell employee say that they have never heard her yell, explaining that the Duchess gives clear direction and is solution-oriented. So they're parroting what Meghan said about herself in the Archetypes podcast. You know,
I'm particular. You're allowed to set a boundary. You're allowed to be clear.
Yep.
It does not make you demanding. It does not make you difficult. It makes you clear.
and that's what she said in response to accusations of her bullying and being a difficult person. But given what we know about Meghan, what's been put out there in public that she hasn't sued over yet, all the bullying allegations from across the pond and that have now plagued her all the way to the US, how can we truly believe what this current staff member, so still on the payroll, says? What if they're rationalizing? What if they did see her treat people poorly and just justify it as, oh, she's just clear, she's just particular? Now the next one's really interesting, and it will make sense if you watched last week's video or if you know a lot about cult leader personality types already. We always hear time and time again that they're charismatic, they're very magnetic, they lure people in. And so what can happen sometimes is people start mistaking this charisma, this confidence, for competence. I'm sure you've seen this play out before your eyes at some point. Someone, maybe a new boss or even a new employee, struts into a room like they own it. They're oozing confidence from every pore. They talk like they know their. But then time passes, you get to know them, and it turns out they know absolutely nothing. In fact, it turns out that the person is actually downright terrible, evil even. Problem is, a lot of people don't see through that. And so they keep looking up to that person, following their lead. And before you know it, they've been converted to loyal followers who've been conned. As humans, we're all social creatures to some extent, and for the most part, we feel like we want to be part of a group. But for some people, that's not enough. For some people, they want to be part of a special group, one that's doing important work that will change the world for the better or for the worse. Basically, they're looking for a sense of purpose, which is prima facie not bad. You know, we all need a sense of purpose to some extent and a reason to live. But what happens when your source of sense of purpose is bad? Is evil? The literature says that the most vulnerable people to fall into this trap, this type of cult-like behavior, this tribalism, are lonely people, people who, as I said, are lacking a sense of purpose or direction in their lives, and people who have mental issues, including personality disorders. Now, that's not to say that every victim of a cult or everyone who falls for these traps suffers from these issues, but people suffering from these types of issues tend to be the most vulnerable and therefore the most targeted by these cult leader type personalities. So what happens is these people can fall prey to groupthink and tribalism, and to cling on to that sense of belonging. The evil purposes or objectives of the group can eventually override their own individual moral compass out of fear of being excommunicated. The literature also touched upon what's called the bystander effect and diffusion of responsibility. For example, think of the Nazis and even P. Diddy's employees or anyone who enabled him and was participating actively in his enterprise. They probably noticed that everyone else around them was okay with what was going on. You know, even the folks over at Harrods with Mohammed Al-Fayed. And so you feel less personally responsible for intervening. And then that in turn leads to a diffusion of guilt. You know, if you're not responsible for something, then how could you possibly feel guilty for it? Which then makes it easier for people to ignore or justify the evil actions being committed right before their eyes. If you know anything about cult leaders and malignant narcissists in general, you'll know that brainwashing, manipulation, love bombing, gaslighting are their tricks of the trade. It's virtually how they get most of their stuff done. Once I was physically assaulted by someone who didn't even know me because of someone else who had a problem with me and wouldn't leave me alone, basically. Imagine you get assaulted by a stranger because someone else told them to, and you kind of go, how could you do that? How could anyone in their right mind do that? I mean, it turns out that person wasn't exactly in their right mind, but I digress. They recruit people, as we discussed last week, through love bombing, and once they've got you in their web, that's when manipulation and gaslighting and the brainwashing starts. And finally, honestly, this is the one that I always land on, if someone's not getting paid especially. Maybe they're just evil themselves. Sigmund Freud believed that every human being has an innate tendency to be aggressive and destructive, evil, basically. It reminds me of that saying in Harry Potter, I believe it was Sirius Black who told Harry, we all have lightness and darkness inside us, and it's up to us to choose what side we want to align with. Some people recognize the evil in others, and it's almost like they live vicariously through them, and so they follow them because they see this kinship and this satisfaction through that kind of vicarious living. And I personally believe, after 4 years now of dealing with online hate, bullying, harassment from mostly Amber's Army and now the Sussex Squad, most of these people fall within this reason. They're just evil themselves. And if they were in a position of power, like Meghan Markle, for instance, then they would probably do exactly what she's been doing. I mean, apparently they're congratulating her and applauding her for making grown men cry. So yeah, such is the cesspool that we live in, sorry. I hope you managed to learn something from this. It really always bothered me why evil people have a following, a loyal following at that. And so it's good to finally have some kind of understanding, not that I didn't have a general sense, but just reading it from experts and, if anything, bolstering what I already had a suspicion of, what I already thought I knew. So let me know what you think of this topic and whether you've had any personal experiences with this type of mob mentality in your personal lives even. I've heard of narcissistic families where you've got the scapegoat and everyone's attacking the person who's not falling in line with the narcissistic person, normally a parent. So it's everywhere, unfortunately. And it's up to us to wake up to the signs and, if possible, remove ourselves from these scenarios. I will say it is really unfortunate that there are so many people who are willing to turn a blind eye. Even if you're working for someone, I mean, I'm sure there are other jobs you could do that don't involve all the depravity and criminality that your current boss is engaging in. I'm looking at people who work, for P. Diddy and covered for him, there really is no excuse in my books. Thanks for coming to my Pluto talk, and I'll see you in the next one. Ciao, ciao.